Continue with the functional nervous system. Part D, the second part. This is a look at the spinal cord. Now remember, the anatomy of the spinal cord was covered in the first part. The spinal cord has two general functions. One, spinal reflexes, and two, transmission of information up and down the spinal cord. Let's look at spinal reflexes. It's a type of somatic reflex because the brain also has reflexes. It's a quick, involuntary response to a stimulus. It requires a receptor, a sensory neuron, central nervous system center, motor neuron, and an effector. Usually this is a muscle. One type of spinal reflex is a monosynaptic reflex. An example would be the muscle stretch reflex. The nerve impulse travels from a receptor, R, through a sensory neuron into the spinal cord, into the central nervous system, and out from the central nervous system in a motor neuron to the muscle. A polysynaptic reflex, such as a withdrawal reflex, the nerve impulse begins in a receptor, travels by way of a sensory neuron to the central nervous system, up the central nervous system in an interneuron, or down as the case may be, and out from the central nervous system by way of a motor neuron to the muscle. How many neurons are involved in a monosynaptic reflex? Aha! If you said one, because monosynaptic sounds like one synapse, well, that's true, there's one synapse. The question was how many neurons? 2. If you touch a hot stove and withdraw your hand in the polysynaptic reflex, as described in the diagram, will you feel pain from the heat of the stove? No. In order to feel pain, the nerve impulses must be transmitted to the conscious centers of the brain in order to feel pain. Let's look at some of the details of the muscle stretch reflex. An example of such a reflex is the patellar tendon reflex when the doctor taps your knee with a hammer. To tap the patellar ligament causes stimulation of the stretch receptor in the quadriceps femoris muscle. This is a muscle on the upper part of the thigh. A sensory neuron transmits impulses into the central nervous system, the spinal cord, and a motor neuron transmits the impulses back out to the quadriceps femoris muscle. The muscle will contract, causing the leg to jerk. Meantime, a branch of the sensory neuron stimulates an inhibitory motor neuron, indicated by D, to transmit to the hamstring muscles. These are on the other side of the thigh. Contraction of the hamstring is therefore inhibited. This is called reciprocal inhibition. Let's look at the withdrawal reflex. The withdrawal reflex requires contraction of the flexor muscle and relaxation of the extensor muscle in this example. This is another example of reciprocal inhibition. This is ipsilateral, that is, on the same side of the spinal cord. Think of removing your hand when touching a hot stove. Pain receptors in the hand are stimulated, nerve impulses are transmitted to the spinal cord by sensory neurons. Interneurons transmit the impulses to stimulate excitatory motor neurons to contract the flexor muscles and inhibitory motor neurons to inhibit the hamstring muscle. This causes the extensor muscles to relax. What about a cross-extension reflex? A reflex often is coupled with a cross-extension reflex on the other limb. This is contralateral, meaning on the opposite side. Imagine stepping on a piece of glass. Thigh flexor would contract. The extensor would relax to lift the leg. At the same time, to maintain your balance, the other leg, the contralateral side, the flexors relax and the extensors contract. The neurons involved are the sensory neurons, interneurons, and motor neurons. Let's look at muscle stretch receptors. Many reflexes involve a muscle spindle, a type of stretch receptor. It functions to maintain muscle tension when length changes. For example, holding an object while raising the arm. It also maintains muscle length when tension changes. For example, holding the arm steady while carrying weight. Proprioception is a sense to inform the central nervous system of muscle length and tension, body movements, and body position. You remember when we covered motor and sensory neurons or nerves, we said that a motor nerve also has a sensory function, and that function is proprioception. Now, the function there is to help the motor nerve carry out its activity. After all, the muscle needs to know what the muscles are doing in order to control them. A person who might lose the sense of proprioception would not be able to move at first. Later, the person might learn to consciously move each limb when, for example, lying in bed, but would have to look at the limb to do so. If the room was dark, it would be impossible to move the limb. Eventually, it became possible to learn to walk and even drive a car. Here's a view of a single motor unit with its muscle spindle. The regular muscle fibers involved in the muscle work are the extrafusal fibers. The fibers are supplied by a neuron, a motor neuron called an alpha motor neuron. The muscle spindle includes stretch receptors in the middle, modified muscle fibers called intrafusal fibers at either end. The spindle is supplied by another motor neuron called a gamma motor neuron. This changes the tension of the intrafusal fibers to adjust the length of the stretch receptors. Let's say the tension of the stretch receptors is set so the sensory neurons transmit to the central nervous system at a rate of 10 impulses per second. The greater the stretch, the greater the impulse frequency along the sensory neurons. The whole muscle spindle is enclosed by a capsule. To maintain muscle tension when length changes, for example, holding an object with the arm motionless, for correct function, the stretch receptor must have a set length. At a set length, the sensory neuron transmits a given frequency, let's say, for example, 10 per second in our example. Assume you are holding your forearm out, holding an object in your hand, using only your biceps brachii muscle. You consciously select its initial position. Unknown to you, the motor units in the muscle are constantly changing length ever so slightly as they contract and relax to hold the arm steady. When a motor unit relaxes, the forearm begins to fall and the muscle begins to elongate. At the same time, the stretch receptor tends to lengthen. The impulse frequency to the spinal cord in the sensory neuron increases. The impulse frequency in the alpha neuron increases, signaling the extrafusal fibers contract. The extrafusal fibers contract, restoring the tension in the motor unit to normal. Conversely, when the muscle contracts, that is, shortens, stretch receptors tend to shorten. The impulse frequency in the sensory neurons to the spinal cord decreases. The impulse frequency in the alpha motor neurons decreases, allowing the extrafusal fibers to relax. The extrafusal fibers relax, restoring the tension in the motor unit back to normal. How about maintenance of muscle tension when the length changes? For example, holding an object while raising the arm. Assume you're holding a weight, let's say a 1-pound weight, in your hand. Your muscle is generating a certain tension, 1 pound of tension, hold the 1-pound weight, obviously. The length of the stretch receptor signals the muscle to maintain 1 pound of tension. Contract your muscle to raise the weight. When the muscle contracts, the muscle shortens. The spindle and stretch receptors shorten. The stretch receptor must be set back to its original length to signal the muscle to maintain 1 pound of tension. The intrafusal fibers contract, stretch receptor is stretched back to its original length. How would the spindle maintain muscle length when the tension changes? For example, holding your arm steady while adding objects. Consider holding an object in the hand at a given level using one muscle, biceps brachii. The stretch receptor is set by the gamma motor neurons, stimulating the intrafusal muscle fibers to maintain the proper stretch. Sensory neuron transmits an average frequency of impulses for the spinal cord. Add a weight. How does the muscle know to contract further to hold the weight? Unknown to you, the changes below are so slight as to be unnoticed. The biceps is stretched, the muscle spindle is stretched, the stretch of the stretch receptor is increased. The sensory neurons transmit an increased frequency of impulses of the spinal cord. The alpha motor neurons transmit an increased frequency back to the biceps muscle, and the biceps increases its tension with an isometric contraction to maintain the constant length, the state of contraction. This causes the stretch receptor to shorten. Meanwhile, the gamma motor neurons stimulate the intrafusal fiber to contract to restore the original length of the stretch receptors. Hold the hand at the same level. Add an additional weight to the hand. How does the muscle know to contract further to hold the additional weight? The biceps is stretched more. The muscle spindle is stretched more. The stretch of the stretch receptor is increased. The sensory neurons transmit an increased frequency of impulses to the spinal cord. Alpha motor neurons transmit an increased frequency of impulse to the biceps. The biceps increases its tension to maintain the constant length state of contraction. Meanwhile, the gamma motor neurons stimulate the intrafusal muscle fibers to contract to restore the original stretch of the stretch receptor. Remove the weights. What does the muscle know to relax? The biceps is relaxed, the muscle spindle is relaxed, the stretch on the stretch receptor is decreased. Sensory neurons transmit a lower frequency of impulses to the spinal cord. Alpha motor neurons transmit a lower frequency of impulses to the bicep. The biceps generates a weaker contraction. The muscle spindles, however, must have a set length to effectively the interfusal fibers to contract or relax to maintain the set tension on the stretch receptors. If the muscle spindle relaxes too much, however, it stops sending impulses to the spinal cord and control is lost. The second general function of the spinal cord is transmission of information. Somatic information is transmitted to and from the brain by two major tracts, somatic sensory or ascending tracts, and somatic motor or descending tract. Somatic sensory pathways are often 3-neuron pathways between the receptor and the center in the central nervous system. They include first-order neurons that conduct from the receptor to the central nervous system. The axons are located within the nerves, the sensory nerves. The cell bodies are located in the dorsal root ganglia of the spinal nerves. Second-order neurons. These conduct up the central nervous system, usually to the thalamus. The axons are located within the white matter of the central nervous system, and the cell bodies are located in the gray matter of either the spinal cord or the medulla. The axons cross to the opposite side of the central nervous system. You've heard that the left side of the brain runs the right side of the body, and the right side of the brain controls the left side. Well, it's the second-order neurons that cross pathways from one side to the other. Then there are the third-order neurons. They conduct from the thalamus to the cerebral cortex. The axons are located in the white matter of the brain, and the cell bodies are located in the gray matter of the thalamus. Somatic motor pathways are often 2-neuron pathways between the center in the central nervous system and the muscles. They include an upper motor neuron, UMN, which conduct down the central nervous system. The axons are within the white matter of the central nervous system, and the cell bodies are in the gray matter of the precentral gyrus of the brain. The lower motor neurons, LMN, conduct from the central nervous system to the muscle. The axons are within nerves, motor nerves, and the cell bodies are in the dorsal horn gray matter of the spinal cord. Let's look at the sensory tracts in more detail. The destination is post-central gyrus. Somatic sensory or ascending tracts include the posterior column pathway, the spinothalamic pathway, and the spinocerebellar pathway. Notice the names of these pathways. They're often named in the order of conduction. For example, spinothalamic conducts from the spinal cord to the thalamus. Spinocerebellar from spinal cord to cerebellum. The diagram below shows their location within the spinal cord, and the complex figure to the right illustrates the axons and their paths. Let's look at the details. Let's look first at the posterior column pathway. It transmits information about proprioception from muscle spindles and Golgi tendon organs. These are stretch receptors, and fine touch and proprioception from tactile corpuscles. These are commonly called Meissner's corpuscles. The two components are the fasciculus gracilis, conducting from the lower part of the body, and the Fasciculus cuneatus, conducting from the upper part of the body. To help remember which is which, think of gracilis coming from graceful, and a graceful person uses the legs, whereas cuneatus sounds more like cunning, so that would be closer to the brain. The Fasciculus gracilis, first-order neurons, travel from the receptors and they extend into the spinal cord and all the way up to the medulla. They synapse in the nucleus gracilis in the medulla. The second-order neurons arise from that nucleus and cross to the other side and extend to the thalamus. They synapse in the gray matter of the thalamus. Finally, the third-order neurons extend from the thalamus to the so-called touch in the foot center in the cerebral cortex. What about the fasciculus cuneatus? Notice it's located in the cross-section of the spinal cord, slightly lateral to the gracilis. First-order neurons travel from the receptor into the spinal cord and extend up to the medulla. They synapse there in the nucleus cuneatus. The second-order neurons then travel from that nucleus, crossing to the opposite side and ending up in the thalamus. They synapse in the gray matter of the thalamus with the third-order neurons, and these extend from the thalamus to the cortex, the touch in the arm center, actually in the cerebral cortex. Then there's the spinothalamic pathway. This transmits information from free nerve endings of pain and temperature, pressure, and crude touch, both in the upper and lower parts of the nervous system. Unlike the last pathway, this is not divided into upper and lower parts. Components include the lateral and ventral spinothalamic tracts. First-order neurons synapse with the second-order neuron in the level of entrance into the spinal cord. The second-order neurons cross to the other side shortly after the synapse and extend to the thalamus. Notice these neurons bypass the medulla. Third-order neurons extend from the thalamus to the cerebral cortex for the so-called pain in the arm or pain in the leg centers. And then there's the Spinocerebellar pathway. This transmits information about proprioception from muscle spindles and Golgi tendon organs. Its components are the dorsal and ventral spinocerebellar tracts. Notice they're located toward the lateral side in the cross-section of the spinal cord. These happen to be two neuron pathways, unlike the previous. The reason for that is, if you remember the embryonic development of the nervous system, the neural tube closes, the cerebellum is somewhere between the cerebral cortex and the spinal cord, so there's no reason these axons should extend all the way to the thalamus or the cerebral cortex. The first-order neurons synapse with the second-order neurons at the level of entrance into the spinal cord. The second-order neurons extend up to the medulla and immediately cross to the other side and extend to the cerebrum, to the cerebellum, I should say. What about motor tracts? Well, they arise in the precentral gyrus. We'll have more to say about that later. Somatic motor or descending tracts include the pyramidal tracts, also called the corticospinal pathways, and the extra-pyramidal pathways. The pyramidal pathways transmit mainly from primary motor areas in the precentral gyrus by way of upper motor neurons and lower motor neurons. They transmit to the skeletal muscles. Let's look at the pyramidal pathways and paralysis. Damage to pyramidal pathways leads to various kinds of paralysis involving the absence of voluntary movements. Spastic paralysis is one form. It's due to injury to the upper motor neurons. Flaccid paralysis, on the other hand, is due to injury in the lower motor neurons. If an upper motor neuron is damaged, is voluntary contraction of the muscle possible? No, because impulses from the cerebral cortex cannot reach the muscle. Would the muscles contract if a hot stove was touched? Yes, impulses can travel from receptor to muscle in a spinal reflex. So, spasticity results. The muscles do contract, but not voluntarily. Could a person feel pain from the hot stove? Yes, because the sensory pathways are not affected. If a lower motor neuron was damaged, is voluntary contraction of the muscle possible? No, for the reasons stated above. Would the muscle contract if a hot stove was touched? No, because the impulses cannot travel from receptor to muscle in the reflex arc. Would the person feel pain from the hot stove? Yes, as described above. In summary, damage to pyramidal pathways leads to two types of paralysis in which voluntary movement is absent. Spastic paralysis is due to injury to the upper motor neurons. Reflexes are present. Flaccid paralysis is due to injury to lower motor neurons. Reflexes are absent. The extrapyramidal pathways include many other motor pathways. They have many neurons, so it's referred to as a multineuronal pathway. In this example, there are 4 in the pathway. There's 1, the second, the third, and the last. Examples include the tectospinal tracts. They're involved in reflex head turning. The reticulospinal tracts involved in posture, and vestibulospinal tracts involved in balance. Notice once again the names. The first part of the name involves the site where it arises, and the second part of the name, spinal in this case, refers to the second location of transmission. And this is the end of the second part of the central nervous system. You're ready now to begin with third part of Part B, central nervous system.